All right. So our next session is focused on risk as well. And as Howard talked about the hyper-complex risk environment, we've got Greg Parks here, who's the manager of, sorry, I've got to read this, Risk Analysis and Data Services at WECC. And he's going to walk through WECC's risk assessment process and how the use of the risk register and the annual risk report might help your organization in your assessments on your compliance program. So if you please join me in welcoming Greg Parks to the stand, we'll move on.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Howard. A little bit about myself. I've been in the industry for 35 years, 2 weeks ago. So been around for a long time. You can tell you've been around a long time when somebody you hired as an intern is now a director or a manager of compliance somewhere you used to work. So that's how you know you've been around a long time. So Casey Jones is here from NV Energy. I gave him his first tour of a control center years ago. So he had very wide eyes about how we operated the grid back then. So glad to see Casey here. Howard touched on some really, really interesting things that is really of interest to me personally. And a little bit about what we're doing at WECC around risk is really interesting. Risk is dependent upon your perspective. And I think this room really shows that. Your organizations would not be allowing you to be here if there wasn't a reason to mitigate the risk from your organization. And I'd argue that perhaps your reason for identifying risk might have a financial component to it. Or your entities probably wouldn't be investing as heavily in compliance as they do. Compliance and oversight at WECC probably has a similar, different perspective of what risk is. And they kind of look at the world through their lens of how big is the entity, how much resource do they have, what kind of impact will they have to grid operations. Well, what we're doing at WECC with the risk register is probably a brand new way to look at risk. And we're trying to be independent of perspective on what risk really means. And we're trying to do that really through this department that was stood up about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, and that's Risk Analysis and Data Services. When I hired on a year ago, I've been at WECC for almost a year now, it was really interesting. Risk Analysis and Data Services, that's a real interesting combination. But the whole theory behind what we're doing with our risk register is making it a data-driven process. And that's really, really important. We're trying to take all subjectivity out of our decisions and basing our decisions based on what the data is telling us. So this department was set up, we're a very small department. We currently have about 5, soon to be 6 in about a week. I'm so excited I got to hire another person. We are really looking to change what WECC is doing as far as identification of risk to reliability and security of the Western Interconnection. So that's just my spiel on what risk analysis and data services is. Just a short story. I talk a lot, so please bear with me. I started with WECC a year ago, and within a month, they threw me on a team with Deb McInfender on standards development. And so I thought, that is really weird. I'm not on the oversight side of the team. I'm in the RAPA house, which is reliability assessment and performance analysis. Why would they ever put me in here? And what we're trying to do at WECC, I think what WECC's overall vision and mission is holistically look at how we're doing things. So there was a question about, are we going to be using a line to identify and focus our risk? Yes. So data services is looking at all the data that is available at WECC, and we have a lot, to really pinpoint where these risks are. So eventually, as our process matures, you will see that. So that's the opening, and I probably said more than I should have, but we'll go through this really quickly. So my presentation is, what is the risk register? Why have a risk register? How is the risk register maintained, and who can participate? And when is involvement needed? We really need involvement, by the way. So the WIFM for everybody in here is, I'm a firm believer that there is going to be an effect on compliance monitoring. When we're starting to talk about resource adequacy, we saw it with Jerry and Heather this last winter. we had about 6 entities in the Pacific Northwest all have energy emergency alerts during the same week. That's probably the first time ever we've had more than one have an EEA in the Pacific Northwest. And that really tells us that we're starting to see impacts of resource adequacy in large regions of the West. So everybody talks about Texas and they shed 20 gigawatts of operator-initiated load shed. As a former system operator, I think that is so awesome. When you look at those events, that was a fabulous example of properly trained operators doing what was needed to make sure the grid didn't go black. Now, NERC and FERC might look at it differently, but from an operational perspective, we can always shed load. So if you're talking about how may it affect compliance, I think load shed is really important as our resource adequacy issues come to light, and we're starting to see that throughout the West. And the second thing is it really should inform what you're doing in your own compliance program. We really shouldn't be worried about those issues that might be local but really don't overall impact interconnection reliability. So that's hopefully what's in it for you. We are following a very formal risk process at WECC. It's based on ISO 31000, loosely based but pretty close. And we're trying to identify the top facing risks in the Western interconnection. And we are, I would say, we're on version 0 of our risk register. This is the first year that we've actually published the register and published the risk report. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing this year and what our next steps are across WECC. So on the risk analysis overview, we look at several things. The first thing we do is we have to have a risk statement. Pretty standard, but it's probably the most important step in what we're doing for properly identifying the risk. We got to know what the condition is. We have to know what it's going to cause as far as reliability or security impacts, or the consequence, how big it's going to be, and then we have to know what the cause of that risk is. Why did that risk occur? And we're going to have some examples of those coming up. Then we have to do an impact and likelihood estimate. This is SMEs at WECC doing this likelihood and impact assessment. And then we do a timing of the risk. And through all of that analysis, we'll come up with a ranking of that risk definition. So pretty programmatic. I really like it. And it's based on data. It's not based on opinion. If we can't back it up with some data, we're not going to rank it appropriately. So everything we're doing with the risk register is done programmatically based on a data set somewhere, or some way. So you can find the risk register at this link. This is the newest copy. We update it anytime it changes. And it's really important to understand that we do change the risk register. Our goal is to not have this a static once every 2-year process like a lot of our other processes. No offense to NERC or previous departments at WECC, but we used to do it every couple of years. Our process today it's active. It's going to be changed when a risk is identified. We'll talk about a couple of those, but Howard mentioned large loads. We have a large load task force that's working at WECC already, advisory group, I'm sorry. NERC is going to be having one also kick off real soon. We actually got the jump, and I'm not sure how we did it, but we did get a jump on the large load. And out of that advisory group, we expect to see at least 4 new risks added to our risk register. And you start thinking about large loads. How can you have 4 independent risks out of large loads? We've got at least 4. And some of them are operational, some of them are modeling, some of them are resource adequacy. It's across the spectrum of where we think large loads are going to be impacting the Western interconnection. But this is supposed to be an active process, so this link will change, this document will change. This takes you to a spreadsheet. We're slowly transitioning to a better format for you all to view. Right now it's in a spreadsheet. So we have several risk categories that we developed. We can add to these categories as we need to. Right now we have cybersecurity. That's a significant portion of our risk register. Extreme natural events, very high focus in the West. Infrastructure, supply chain is a big issue going on in the West. I know we've seen less than half of our facilities that we expect to be built in any year are actually being built. So when we're doing assessments, we're already a year behind as soon as that assessment is done, because what was expected to be built that year really isn't built. Personnel, grain workforce, that's me. We are seeing significant impacts when we look at system protection that are either engineering or technician caused. Are those things that are impacting reliability? Absolutely. I've been hearing about the Great Tsunami for 35 years, by the way, so I'm starting to live it, so it's kind of nice. Physical security, of course, and then other. Grid transformation is probably the one that we all talk about the most, and we've broken that down into 3 different sections. Resource adequacy, of course, inverter-based resources, and the changing resource mix are the 3 that we look at. So I'm going to walk through about 5 of our top 5 risks on the risk register right now, and just talk about where we're at and why we're doing it, and then some of the things that we may do or not do with these risks. One of the decisions that we make is, can we actually move the needle? So our goal is to actually move the needle when we can. So the first one, of course, is large and prolonged heat waves. We've all been living with that for the last couple of years. We've had 2 out of 4 years, I think, that we've had load shed or near load shed events during the summertime in the West, and that's really what this is trying to identify. We believe that this causes beyond our control, that we're going to continue to experience very large heat waves, what we consider extreme weather going forward. So we have a extreme natural events advisory group ongoing. They've developed a white paper initially, and we're integrating that work into our risk register on mitigation actions. Truthfully, WECC will not be able to move a lot on this, but when we're starting to talk about compliance and oversight, if we don't have enough resources, we're going to be going to load shed. And load shed is a bad word, but when I took my first NERC test, they told you if you didn't know the answer, pick load shed. It's the right one. The next one we're going to talk about real quickly is performance and validation issues. And we've been living with that continuously in the Western Interconnection since 2016, and probably before 2016. That was just when Blue Cut first was large enough to identify it. I can not proudly say we experienced another loss of IBR in the last quarter. Back this summer, we had another IBR event. Hasn't been done an event analysis on. James will be working on that soon, I'm sure. But the IBR events are not going away. And the big issue with this risk in particular is that we need to be able to study the interconnection. Right now, we are seeing parts of California that are approaching 100% renewable on average for certain periods of the day. And if we don't properly study these systems, we're not going to be able to reliably operate them. So this risk is really around performance and validation issues and those things that aren't happening. We have a lot of data at WECC that really supports the need for this. One of the things that we really probably need to do better is produce better models. And that's transmission planning models and generator models. If we have a large region of the Western Interconnection that's 100% renewable today compared to their load, we better have a transmission model that accurately portrays that topology of the interconnection. So that's what this risk is actually trying to address. I do want to make a comment. I want to thank FERC for coming out with Order 901. I'll probably be the only person here that thanks FERC. But a lot of our risks, it's kind of interesting. This risk register was developed, it's been in process for about 1.5 years, 2 years. And many of our top risks were identified by the FERC Order 901, which is not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence. So when we actually talk about mitigation of some of our risks, we have a lot of transfer in our risk register right now. And that's because of the ongoing standards work going on at the NERC level. So to me, that was really complimentary, that what we're doing at WECC is really in line with what the regulators are saying we should do at the FERC level, and obviously what NERC has taken up with the 901 order. Geo registration and NERC reliability, right into the Order 901 stuff. So Howard talked about this quite a bit. This is one of our top risks on the risk register. We are not doing any mitigation because, believe it or not, we're doing a lot of mitigation. So when we look at what WECC is doing to mitigate this risk, we're registering a whole bunch of generators. We consider this an extreme risk when we did our ranking. So pretty high risk that we get these generators registered, so then we can do the follow-up modeling and performance validation, of course. Here's a new one you may not have seen. Forced oscillations from battery energy storage system. I don't think there's a standard that ever talks about forced oscillations from battery energy storage system. The Western Interconnection's had at least 2 or 3 events in the immediate past where we had a forced oscillation occur due to battery energy storage systems control systems. And so we consider this is probably one of our most extreme, highest risks on the interconnection right now. At the end of 2023, we had about 9,800 megawatts of batteries installed in the Western Interconnection, grid-connected batteries. A majority of those were in California. We expected to have, by June 1st of 2024, nearly 20,000 megawatts of grid-connected batteries. What's really interesting about a battery versus a normal PV plant is if you ever worked in a power plant, a PV facility is fundamentally wide open. The valve's wide open. There's really not a lot of control interaction at a PV plant. If the sun's up, you're going to produce megawatts. When the sun goes down, you don't. A battery is just the complete opposite of that. Not only do you get to control it whenever you want, you get to charge it whenever you want also. And when I say you, I'm talking about the generator owner. And that's one of the things that we're seeing is these are all facilities that are not necessarily put in for essential reliability services. They're fundamentally there to make money, which we all are, but the batteries are really showing that they are a very unique resource. This forced oscillation is something that we just entered into the risk register last week. The RRC voted it in, but I don't see anything other than a standard developed to address this risk. I don't know that you can write papers and write papers and write papers on something like this. Power system stabilizers are probably the closest analogy that we can come to in our generation world to some of the things we're seeing with IBRs. This is a power system stabilizer on crack, basically. It has the impact of really causing some destructive issues in the Western or in any interconnection. We saw a forced oscillation in the Eastern Interconnection a couple of years ago of a 75 megawatt combustion turbine in Florida that caused massive power flows on the 500 kV systems out of Florida and propagated all the way across the Eastern Interconnection. So I've heard stories of 700 megawatt batteries in the West. So that's a 1,400 megawatt impact. That will cause some damage if it's not properly operated, programmed, and controlled. So we feel this is one of our most extreme risks coming at us in the near future after seeing some of the events that actually occurred during testing. Another top risk is drought. We think this is a resource adequacy issue more than anything. I want to highlight we don't have a cause of it. We try not to make political statements at WECC. So what is the cause? Is it carbon? We could put the cause down here, but we intentionally have not put a cause on this one. So risk register evolution. Today we're at 46 risks, 15 recent additions as of last week. We do have an initiation form. So who can participate in this? Anybody that can click a link can participate and email the risk register for any initiation that needs to be addressed. The forced oscillation was a recent one that was implemented by industry. I think WECC is going to be probably through their advisory groups implementing 4 risk register items from the large loads. I think we have more on the horizon coming at us. But honestly, I think the process is supposed to be driven by the industry. That's our dream and our hope is that the industry identifies these before WECC does. A lot of our data is not real time. Most of our data is after the fact. Some of our data is even a year old. So I was quoting some battery statistics. That comes from our LNR data request that we do annually. So we won't know what happened in 2024 for a lot of things until about February or March of 2025. So we would expect the industry to be much more rapid about initiating a risk register or a risk item that has been developed in the near term. We don't expect the risk register to change much as far as the items on it. We do hope to move the needle. So that's our overall goal, is to move the needle of what these risks are. I'd love to come back to this group in a year or two and say forced oscillations are no longer a risk and they're no longer extreme. That's the goal of the risk register, is to move the needle on the risk. So we're also moving to a regional evolution. Right now, anytime you talk to WECC, they kind of get out the jar of peanut butter and they spread it all the way across the interconnection. And our data really shows that what's important to the desert Southwest really doesn't impact the Pacific Northwest at this time. So our focus at the risk register is to really start saying, should we be focusing on certain things regionally? And again, data driven. Extreme weather probably is not going to impact San Diego to the same extent that it impacts Seattle or Boise, Idaho. And that's what we're talking about regional evolution. So this is really going across into our reliability assessments work. We're talking about, where do we have regional problems? We shouldn't be just doing a Western interconnection look at anything, because it is not one problem across the interconnection. So another thing that we look at is risk appetite. Generally, in any kind of risk scenario, you have to mitigate the extreme and highs. I don't know that we'll actually be able to do that, especially when you start talking about extreme natural events. The mitigation may be, we have to learn to adapt and recognize that we may not be able to serve load every hour of every day. So I just wanted to make that clear, that some of these we will not be able to mitigate. We have a lot of, on the extreme natural events risk, we have tsunamis and earthquakes and haboobs and things that may be out of control of system design or system operators, but we're going to recognize it, is the point. All the risks are going to be debated for how we're going to mitigate them. So right now, this is a RRC process, a committee at WECC that does this mitigation decision. But I can tell you that this is being looked at across every department at WECC and not just the committee structure. So I believe it's when you start talking about what's in it for you, our oversight plans are going to start looking at the risk register and saying, why are we not doing something specific? If it's on the risk register, we better be tailoring our compliance and oversight visits based on those risks that we see in the risk register. And then the RRC, the committee, the Reliability Risk Committee, can formally or informally determine the tolerability. And we do that periodically. So our risk treatment options are to accept the risk. That means we just we monitor it. We know it's there. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It just means more than likely our appetite for doing any reduction is not there. Wildfire is a really good example of that. I think WECC has done an absolutely fabulous job with our wildfire monitoring. We have collected a ton of data. We've really built some tools for the industry on identifying how wildfires are impacting the transmission network, and we do a really good job of presenting that. But are we going to be able to come out and say we need to harden our transmission network against fires? Our data shows that we've done a great job. That's really what our data is showing with risk right now to wildfire. The risk to wildfire to all of you out there in the world is probably financial, and it might be something around how are we going to justify turning off 50,000 customers due to public safety shutoffs. We can reduce the risk, further action, change the likelihood or consequent. And the one you'll see a lot right now is transfer, and that's really because of Order 901. We've determined at this time that we're going to transfer that risk to the standard drafting team processes that are ongoing with 901. But there's other risks that might also be transferred. There's other groups that may have a better ability to actually mitigate that risk than WECC or the RRC. We may decide to avoid it or leave it blank. Realistically, 901 was a great godsend to our risk register because it really made it so we have a lot of work ongoing with a lot of risks on our risk register, and that's with the Order 901. So our timeline, this is a very loose timeline. We plan to publish a risk report annually. There's some folks at WECC that don't like annual things, but we're going to do a risk report annually. Our risk report is really to give us a health of what we're doing and what we've been and have we moved the needle. So this first initial risk report that we just published, we were a little bit late. We're trying to get alignment on everything we do, but was to really set a line in the sand of here we are. Future risk reports are really going to be around here we are and here's what we've done. That's the goal of the risk report, is to identify the actions that have occurred in the previous 24 months. So every year we're going to publish a risk report. We're going to come up with risk treatment determination. By July, we're going to have initial treatment plans identified of those risks that we're going to try to mitigate. We're going to review the treatment plan progress in October at the RRC, and then the RRC will reevaluate the risk ranking every year in December. So a little bit about the risk register. If you ever look at it, there's two sections right now. There's a WECC evaluation and there's an RRC evaluation. So we asked the RRC to evaluate how we've evaluated. Completely independent processes. What we're talking about here for the RRC evaluation is their perspective of how the risks are being done. And then in 2025, we'll refresh the risk report. So the report's available here. It only has 31 of the initially registered risks. We talked earlier, there's 15 more on there already. So we've had a very busy year. It has the inherent risk rating, serves as a snapshot of what we did in 2024, and it's going to allow the tracking of future progress. I really want to stress the risk register is going to be dynamic. We expect it to change mid-year if it's needed to be. Our hope in the near future is that the risk register, we get them identified and we don't have to add 15 in a year. That's our overall goal. We expect to add risks as they develop, but this was a very unique year in that we had a lot of change in our risk register. So we don't expect to add 15 every year. And that's all I'll have, and I'll take any questions about our risk register process.
Thank you. First of all, that was lovely. My name is Maggie Sala. I'm from PG&E, and I have a two-part question.
Okay.
The first part, and I had to step out, so if I missed it and you said this, I apologize. Is there a chance that a risk could be identified that does not tie to a current standard? And the reason I bring that up is that when you look at both sides of the house, the RAPA side and the enforcement and the compliance monitoring side, compliance and enforcement monitoring can only look at the standards themselves. So if there's a risk that doesn't tie, what happens with that? Because you can't really change how you're monitoring because the authority ties to the standards.
Great question. Thank you. I did cover it a little bit, but I'll cover it more in depth. The battery oscillation is a really good example of one that doesn't have a current standard. We don't think everything needs a standard to ensure reliability. Number one, that's my personal belief. A reliability standard is not needed for every aspect of operation. So that's the first one. But your question was, what if there's not a standard? The process is open enough that if WECC determines that there's a gap in standard, and we have a standard development standard team that Deb runs to do this, our process at WECC is we may write a SAR. So I don't know that WECC has written a SAR recently. I don't believe we have, but that is a potential solution, mitigation action of our risk register process. Is if that's what it's taken to move the reliability needle to write a SAR, we would develop a SAR and then initiate the standard drafting team process. I personally think the forced oscillation one, we have to collect more data, of course, but it seems like it's ripe for SAR development. It seems with the amount of batteries that are going on on the interconnection, what our forecasts are, that this is a significant issue that we probably don't want to wait for an event to happen interconnection wide. The potential for damage from a forced oscillation is pretty high. It may be one that, hey, we need to initiate a SAR if the industry doesn't initiate it first.
No, I think that makes sense. I think some of the hesitation is that when I hear risks and they don't tie to where the authority is, I start getting nervous in terms of what am I being audited on or what's being looked at. So that's just food for thought.
And maybe another example is wildfire. You know, there is not a a standard that says we have to harden our transmission network. And I don't think the data is supporting that we would. But WECC is doing a lot of work around wildfire and wildfire impact reliability that may inform compliance and oversight, I think, in the long run, especially when you talk about vegetation management and tree trimming and things associated with right of way. But so we don't expect to always use the same tool to hammer the same nail. Some of them may drive a change in standards, some of them may not.
No, that makes sense. Thank you. My second part is, does WEC have plans to ensure that lines aren't being crossed when it comes to allowing entities to choose what they need to do to mitigate the risks on their system? You could see how there could be a little bit of the graying that can make people nervous.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think we're not saying that the risk register should drive your compliance program. It should definitely inform your compliance program. I've worked in the desert Southwest. I've worked in the Pacific Northwest. When I made a statement that WECC has tended to use the peanut butter approach on a lot of things. I don't think our oversight team, as we develop these IBR standards, IBR applicable standards, are going to do a lot of focus in the Pacific Northwest. Maybe on the wind fleet in the Pacific Northwest, there's not a lot of solar, and our data doesn't support that. So our goal at WECC is to use that data to inform compliance and oversight of where that particular risk is and focus their efforts. Instead of saying every GO in the West, we're going to say every GO in the Southwest. That's hopefully where our risk register is going to go in the near future, is another input into compliance and oversight. When they do their risk-based analysis, they input that same data set and say, we're not going to look at every generator in the Western interconnection the same. Extreme cold weather is the same, EOP 12. I don't think we should be going to San Diego and auditing, spending a lot of effort on EOP 12 in San Diego for generators there. The data doesn't support it. Our GADS data doesn't.
No, that makes total sense. I like the scalpel approach. Thanks.
Yeah, my question is, I think there was even like a gasp in the audience when you were on the slide on hydros and drought conditions. And my question was, you talked about mitigation if the risk is high. What is the mitigation for that one, especially because there's no cause?
So, when we start talking about drought and aridification, there's a lot of things that can affect. You obviously picked up on the ability to generate electricity from when we have a drought. That's a resource adequacy issue. So what does it mean? It means that we're going to have to be hyper diligent about our system planning. I think the real role of WECC around that particular topic is being able to indicate the risk to the rest of the interconnection. I worked at Chelan for 3 years. They know more about the water coming down that river than anybody, including maybe God. They spend a lot of money understanding the water coming down the river. But maybe that information is not communicated outside of those entities that own the hydro system. I think that's somewhere that as we move through this risk register process and mitigation, it's a resource adequacy issue. Do we properly communicate the risk to the rest of the interconnection of what the summer is going to look like? You have to be really dialed into the water system on the Columbia River to really understand what the risk is. And as we become more and more less surplus, I think resource adequacy is one of the largest risks in the West right now. And how does that apply? We don't have authority over resource adequacy in the NERC and FERC world. So what do we rely on? It goes back to my load shed. We better have really, really good rigid plans, and we should train our operators well. We should have really good operational planning analysis done on what our resource mix is going to look like. BAL 7, BAL 8 seem like it becomes more and more important when you start talking about drought and aridification. I know it's not a popular topic, but better planning, obviously. But as we move into the oversight side of it, I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that as our resource mix changes and we become tighter and tighter.
Laren Maran from SMUD. I don't really have a question, but I want to use this opportunity to appeal to the audience that sometimes WECC will send out surveys for various risk register items. So use that survey to provide feedback so that the RRC and the various forums within RRC can refine and make the risks better in terms of how we want to, rank them and make sure we are taking the input from the industry to make it better. That's all.
Thank you very much for the comment. We've had the same conversation internally at WECC. So your comments are not going on deaf ears. We do need to engage our industry more thoroughly on the risk register. There's no question in our minds that that's a significant area of improvement, and we do recognize it. So thanks for the comment.
Well, then, Greg, you just stole my thunder. Mike Almeida with Archer Energy Solutions. You mentioned earlier that the risk register evolution is something that you're encouraging. You said anyone can participate. So my question is, aside from providing a forum or at least a document where people can participate, what do you envision as plans to have more industry collaboration? I mean, entities, vendors, regulatory. What does that look like for you in maybe the next 18 months?
Thank you for the question. Our stakeholder services side has been very, very engaged with our risk register, and we're looking. I don't want to get ahead of where we're at, but we're having conversations almost on the weekly basis of how we do engage the industry, our stakeholders, the regulators, FERC and NERC, everybody on what our risk register is actually telling us. We expect the risk register to inform NERC. We expect it to inform FERC. But we definitely need stakeholder engagement, and we've been working all the way through the levels of WECC to really figure out how we're going to do that in the upcoming years. So it's not something that we are just walking down the road saying everything we're doing is great and look at us go, because we realize we have a lot of opportunity to do a lot more. I think I don't want to. I really want to give credit to the folks that have worked on this well before I came into WECC. This is the right way to do risk assessment. You do it with data, you do it with analytics, you don't do it on opinion. A lot of what has happened historically across the interconnection, and I'll go all the way up to FERC, and I'll probably get in trouble, somebody will probably talk to me, is you have a lot of opinion. And it's the flavor of the day that is really driving a lot of things that are on our risk. We're trying to completely eliminate that and make it as data-driven as we can. And we do have a lot of data to do that. And that's really our goal with the risk register, is take away opinions. And if you can't prove it with the data, you can't prove it. So I'll probably get in trouble. Steve's saying I'm not, but I got a VP. I got two VPs, one at NERC and one at WECC in front of me. So, but that's our goal, is to make it as we live in a world of engineers, and engineers appreciate and understand that if you can't prove it with data, and there's another part of it, and sorry for talking so long. If we can't prove that we have a risk with data, we can't measure the improvement. And that's the second part that we're really looking to work on in the next year, is how do we come up with metrics that are real, that are measurable, so in the coming years we can actually show that we move the needle. I think in my world, we only get upset when we have an extreme event. Yep.
Meg Albright,
Hey,
Bonneville.
Meg.
Hey, Greg,
Hi.
Bonneville Power Administration. My question kind of echoes some of the comments you've just been making. How is this landing at FERC, at NERC, with other interconnections?
I don't know. I'd have to ask Howard. I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be. We're in version 0. This is first year of what we're doing. I think there's a lot of. I'll tell you, at the WECC level, it's all the way through the organization that this is the way we should be doing risk analysis and risk determination. Is if we can't have a data point to quantify it and communicate it. That's one of the things that my group is really in charge of, is how do we portray these risks in some kind of tool that you can actually quantify what that risk really means to me. And so at the WECC level, this goes all the way up to Melanie. This is something that I've heard every department talking about, that we need to integrate the risk register into whatever we do, whether it's reliability assessments, event analysis, operation oversight and planning, all the way through. So I think it's the right way to do it. We've got a ton of data. GADS and TADS is just a mountain of data that we have that I'm very optimistic we can really make some strides with.
Have you had any of the other interconnections reach out to you or ask about it?
Actually, CERC is ahead of the curve on us. We kind of borrowed this process from CERC. So CERC is a year or two ahead of us. So yeah, I think everybody, once they recognize it, they see that this is the way you should be doing risk analysis. You shouldn't get it together every 2 years, get a committee together, write a report. You should be doing it all the time. And that's what we're really trying to do at WECC.
Hi, this is Monica Kaiso. I love the last comment because it kind of related also to the question I had for Howard in Howard's presentation and how, where's that standards feedback loop from a compliance standpoint. And I feel like this risk assessment process being data driven, could also incorporate the standards the objective of the standards being met through the risk assessment that you're pulling together. I would love to see how maybe at the ERO level, this could be coalesced and how, that could provide that compliance scorecard for how we're doing with standards. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, it's already integrated into the process that the NERC risk priorities do reference the regional priorities. What we're trying to do enhance the regional priorities so we can better inform the NERC priorities. So it already is there. I just don't think it's comprehensively done well. So this is the next iteration of that process to make that feedback loop back up into the NERC process better. So I think we are, I hate to say it, I don't like to be bleeding edge on anything. I think we're close to bleeding edge on this.
Yeah, and getting then the reporting and the metrics, the visibility to the results at the ERO level based on this feedback that you're providing would be really great for the industry. My other question is in regards to that collaboration with the industry and in particular your dispositioning process, what type of management approval or what type of approval, stakeholder input gets figured into your dispositioning process, whether something gets transferred, avoided, accepted, what does that look like?
So right now the RRC has their process. So and Meg's the vice chair of it. So thanks, Meg, for coming up and asking a question. So the RRC has a very distinct role in the risk register, but that is only their role. And so I would say the other roles are not defined. I expect other departments within WECC are going to take this up, and how they move forward with their oversight planning, I think, is going to be driven by some of this stuff. But it's designed to be utilized by anybody and everybody. And that's what the purpose of the risk register is. So the RRC has a specific function. We're going to fix things that the RRC has control over. That doesn't mean that's the limit of what is going to happen with the risk register. The risk register can be used by oversight and planning. They can be used by the RAC, the Reliability Assessment Committee at WECC, and it is being done by RAC. And we expect that they would have a different perspective on that than the RRC. So the expectation is it's used by everybody. They would do a different assessment, of course, based on their perspective.
Thank you.
Hi there, Marty Hossel here with the Northern California Power Agency. So I liked your presentation, the risk registry, and I have some ideas for you.
Great.
Modeling, Howard mentioned earlier that they got the attention of vendors and the manufacturers. That's what industry needs help on some of this stuff.
Absolutely.
We need help. We need the vendors to give those models. Fortunately, our company, we're public power, but we don't have any IVRs, us personally, so we don't have that issue.
Not yet.
Not yet, yeah. So, but I do know some of our members do, and they may be subject to, in the future, some of these future standards. So they're going to need help with some of these models because they have legacy systems. And we don't have that information. And we've heard WECC before and others in the modeling group saying, well, we want them to give us the data. Well, they don't have the data. they can't get the data from the manufacturers. Some manufacturers are out of business. So we need help. And another issue is going to be, so there's been a recent NOPR with SIP 13, and industry needs help with that. We need help from NERC, WECC, FERC to get that information. You guys can do it.
Yep.
For us, we've got thousands of entities. Well, for medium impact and high impact, there's not as many. But I've heard from a lot of people that they need help with these questions. They can't get their questionnaires answered by a majority of people. And they can't do that. And now they're trying to make the requirements even more stringent. Well, I would suggest that FERC, NERC, or someone create a national registry in the state of California here, or no, we're not in California now, but where we are. Our Energy Commission created a registry for acceptable manufacturers of inverter-based resources for solar. So we need someone else to vet these vendors and to help us to create a registry. And that's, hopefully you can do it. I know it's going to be cumbersome on a regulating entity, but it's even more cumbersome on industry and the manufacturers or vendors if we have to do the SIP 13, because they have to answer hundreds of questions from several entities. And it'd be better to have, say, you can't do business unless you're in the FERC registry or the NERC registry. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. It sounds like there's a potential risk there that maybe somebody should submit to the risk register. So, but no, I don't disagree. Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's okay.
I don't have a question, but are there any questions online?
Yes, there are.
Oh, gosh.
All right.
I've only got 2 minutes left.
Well, we'll get what we can done. It says, thanks, Greg, for the presentation. On slide 6, the inputs for risk calculation were identified. Was human population / meter density in the areas considered for the risk calculations, or was it just looking at the surface areas of the given locations?
So when we do our risk analysis, we're looking at the potential cost to the interconnection. So it's probably a function of the population density. We don't go into a lot of detail here, but we do look at the cost, and that's one of the inputs into how we determine if it's an extreme. The good example is oscillations. We start breaking generator shafts due to a forced oscillation. It's going to be very, very expensive, and so we do look at cost. It's not just density of population. It's what's it going to cost if that event does propagate across the interconnection.
All right, we have one more for you.
Okay.
Will the annual industry engagement be similar to the level of effort and input we saw in the first year?
It's going to be higher. I just hired another person. It's the second person I've hired since I've become a manager. So there's a pretty strong commitment at WECC to support the risk register process. I was the second person in the risk as a risk analyst, so we're going to have more people on the risk side. So I think there's a pretty good. We're seeing good support from WECC on this is not a one and done issue.
That's it for the online questions. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Do you want to? Okay. Thanks, Greg. We're going to take a break until 11. So if everyone will be back just prior to 11, we'll start off our next session after that. Thank you.